Sometimes the warmest hearts are found in the coldest places. You just have to be brave enough to stay. The rain came down in thin silver lines, steady and relentless, turning the sidewalks of downtown Chicago into mirrors of blurred lights and hurried footsteps. But Emily Carter didn't have the luxury of hurrying. Her sneakers were soaked through, her denim jacket far too thin for the sharp drop in temperature, and the paper bag in her arms, holding the last 2 sandwiches she had saved from her diner's shift, was starting to tear at the bottom. She adjusted her grip, exhaling slowly, trying to ignore the ache in her stomach and the weight of another unpaid bill sitting back in her tiny studio apartment, when she noticed him. At first, he didn't stand out the way billionaires usually do in magazines or on screens. There were no cameras, no tailored suits catching the light, just a man leaning against the side of a dark SUV parked near the curb, his posture rigid. One hand pressed against his chest as if holding something in, his head slightly lowered as the rain soaked through his coat. People passed him without a second glance, umbrellas tilted forward, eyes locked on destinations that mattered more than a stranger's quiet struggle, and for a moment, Emily almost did the same. She had her own problems, her own reasons to keep walking, but something about the way his shoulders tensed, the way his breath seemed uneven even from a distance, made her slow down. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the damp paper bag, the voice in her head reminding her she had nothing left to give, not tonight, not when she barely had enough for herself, but her feet had already turned before she could argue with it. "Hey, are you okay?" she asked gently, stepping closer under the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, her voice cutting softly through the sound of rain. The man looked up, and for a brief second, something unreadable flashed across his face. Surprise, maybe irritation, or something deeper, something tired. His eyes, a striking shade of blue dulled by exhaustion, met hers before quickly shifting away as if he wasn't used to being seen. "I'm fine," he said, his tone clipped, controlled, the kind of voice that didn't invite conversation, the kind that usually ended it. Emily nodded slowly, but she didn't leave. Instead, she set the paper bag down on the hood of the SUV, carefully pulling out one of the sandwiches, the plastic wrap crinkling in the quiet space between them. "You don't look fine," she said, softer now, almost like she was speaking to herself, before holding it out to him. "It's not much, but you should eat something." He stared at the sandwich as if it didn't belong in his world, like it was an unfamiliar object placed in front of him without warning, and for a moment neither of them moved. The city kept going around them, cars passing, distant horns, footsteps echoing. But right there, under that dim light, everything felt suspended. "Why would you do that?" he asked finally, his voice lower this time, less guarded but more confused. Emily gave a small shrug, a faint smile tugging at her lips despite the cold biting at her skin. "Because someone should," she replied simply, as if that was reason enough. The man hesitated, then slowly reached out, his fingers brushing hers for just a second as he took the sandwich, and something in that brief contact, something quiet and unspoken, shifted in the air between them. He didn't say thank you right away, just stood there, looking at the food in his hand like it carried more weight than it should, like it meant more than it was. Emily stepped back, giving him space, pulling her jacket tighter around herself as the rain picked up again. But she didn't walk away just yet. She watched as he finally took a bite, his expression softening in a way that felt almost imperceptible but real, like a crack forming in something that had been frozen for far too long. And she didn't know it then, standing there in soaked shoes and borrowed warmth. But that small, ordinary moment, one sandwich, one quiet act of kindness, was about to change both of their lives in ways neither of them were prepared for. The rain had softened to a quiet drizzle by the time Emily finally pulled her jacket tighter and turned away, her steps slow at first as if part of her was still anchored beneath that flickering street lamp, but she forced herself forward, reminding her heart that moments like that were fleeting, that people did not suddenly become part of your story just because you shared a few minutes in the cold. Still, as she reached the corner and glanced back without meaning to, she saw him standing there, no longer rigid, no longer completely closed off, and for a second, something unfamiliar settled in her chest. Something warmer than the night air allowed. The next morning came. Too early. the pale gray light slipping through the cracked blinds of her tiny studio apartment, illuminating the peeling paint on the walls and the stack of overdue notices on the kitchen counter. Emily sat on the edge of her narrow bed, tying the worn laces of her sneakers, her mind already racing through the list of shifts she had to cover, the extra hours she needed to pick up. The quiet calculation of how long she could stretch what little she had left. The world did not slow down for kindness, she reminded herself, not even for a moment like last night. By the time she stepped into the diner, the familiar hum of coffee machines and clinking plates wrapped around her like a routine she could not escape, and she slipped into it effortlessly, offering polite smiles, taking orders, moving from table to table with the practiced rhythm of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Hours passed in a blur until the door chimed softly, a sound so ordinary it barely registered, but something made her look up anyway, and there he was, not drenched in rain this time, not leaning against a car, but standing just inside the entrance, his presence quieter yet somehow impossible to ignore. He looked different in daylight, more composed, his dark coat clean and structured, his posture straighter, but there was still something in his eyes, that same guarded distance. As if he carried a world no one else could see. Emily froze for half a second, a tray balanced in her hands before quickly setting it down, her heart picking up in a way she did not quite understand. He hesitated, scanning the room like he was not used to places like this, before his gaze found hers, and for a brief moment either of them moved. Then, almost reluctantly, he stepped forward. "I was not sure if you would be here," he said, his voice steady but softer than the night before, like the edges had been worn down just a little. Emily blinked, surprised by the simple fact that he had come back at all. "Most people who take free food do not return the next day," she replied lightly, a hint of humor slipping into her tone as she crossed her arms, though her eyes stayed on his, searching for something she could not quite name. He gave the smallest exhale, almost like a breath he had been holding too long. "I am not most people," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that felt less like arrogance and more like truth. She studied him for a moment longer before nodding toward an empty booth by the window. "Well then, I guess you can start by ordering something that is not free," she said, her smile faint but real this time, and as he walked toward the seat, something shifted again, subtle but undeniable, like the first crack of sunlight after a long winter, and neither of them realized yet that this second meeting was not an accident, that it was the beginning of a pattern, a quiet routine that would slowly, piece by piece, unravel everything they thought they understood about themselves and each other. Alexander Hayes was not used to waiting, not in boardrooms, not in traffic, not even in conversations, yet he sat there in that small booth by the window, hands loosely folded around a cup of coffee he had barely touched, watching the way Emily moved through the diner with a quiet kind of focus that felt completely foreign to his world. She laughed softly with a regular customer, scribbled orders with quick, practiced motions, and somehow remembered exactly how each person liked their eggs or coffee without ever needing to ask twice, and for reasons he could not fully explain, he found himself paying attention to every small detail, as if they mattered more than the endless numbers and contracts that usually filled his days. When she finally returned to his table, setting down a simple plate of scrambled eggs and toast, she tilted her head slightly, studying him with a mix of curiosity and something warmer, something that did not demand anything in return. "You have not eaten much," she said, nodding toward the untouched food, her tone light but observant. Alexander glanced down, almost surprised to see the plate there, as if he had forgotten why he came. "I am not very hungry," he replied, though even he knew it was not entirely true. She raised an eyebrow, crossing her arms gently. "That is not what your face said last night," she said, a hint of teasing slipping into her voice, and for a brief moment, something unexpected happened. The corner of his mouth lifted, just slightly, but enough to feel unfamiliar, almost like a memory he had not accessed in years. Emily noticed it immediately, her own smile widening just a fraction as if she had uncovered something hidden. "There it is," she murmured softly, almost to herself, before turning to refill his coffee. Alexander watched her walk away, that small moment echoing louder than it should have, and he could not remember the last time someone had spoken to him without hesitation, without calculation, without knowing exactly who he was. The hours passed differently that day, slower in some ways, faster in others, and when his phone buzzed in his pocket, the name flashing across the screen carried weight, responsibility, expectation, but he silenced it without answering. His attention drawn back to the simple rhythm of the diner, to the quiet presence of someone who did not expect anything from him. Later, when the lunch rush faded and the tables emptied, Emily slid into the seat across from him without asking, wiping her hands on a small towel, her expression more relaxed now. "So, what do you do when you are not standing in the rain pretending you are fine?" she asked, resting her chin lightly against her palm. Alexander hesitated, the question simple on the surface but complicated in ways she could not see, and for a moment, he considered giving the same vague answer he had used before, something safe, something distant, but instead he found himself saying, "I work in finance." The words measured, incomplete, but closer to truth than he expected to give. Emily nodded slowly, accepting it without probing further, as if she understood that some answers did not need to be forced. "That sounds stressful," she said, her voice softening, and he let out a quiet breath, one that felt heavier than it should have. "It is," he admitted, his gaze drifting toward the window where the city moved endlessly beyond the glass. "But stress is easier than other things." She studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful, before reaching into the pocket of her apron and pulling out a small napkin, setting it gently on the table between them. "Well, for what it is worth," she said, tapping the napkin lightly, "this place has decent coffee, free refills, and no expectations, so you can sit here as long as you need." Alexander looked down at the napkin, then back at her, something shifting quietly in his chest again, something he did not have a name for yet, but something that felt dangerously close to comfort, and as he nodded once, almost imperceptibly, either of them realized that this simple routine, this unspoken agreement to return, to sit, to talk, was slowly becoming the one place in his life where he did not feel like he had to be anyone else. The days that followed did not feel accidental anymore, not to Emily, and definitely not to Alexander, even if either of them said it out loud. He started showing up at the diner at almost the same time every afternoon, always choosing the same booth by the window, always ordering something simple he barely finished, and always staying longer than necessary, as if time moved differently inside those walls. Emily noticed it before she allowed herself to acknowledge it, the quiet pattern forming between them, the way he seemed more at ease each day, the sharp edges in his voice softening into something almost approachable. She would catch him watching her sometimes, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but in a way that felt like he was trying to understand something he had never seen before. One late afternoon, when the diner was nearly empty and the golden light of the setting sun stretched across the floor in long, quiet lines, Emily slid into the booth across from him. Again, this time with 2 cups of coffee already in her hands. "You are becoming a regular," she said, placing one in front of him with a small smile, her tone teasing but gentle. Alexander glanced at the cup, then at her, and for a moment, he almost said something honest, something about how this place had become the only part of his day that did not feel heavy, but instead he simply replied, "It is quieter here than most places." His voice low, measured. Emily leaned back slightly, studying him, her eyes curious but patient. "Quieter does not always mean better," she said softly, tracing the rim of her cup with her finger. "Sometimes it just means you are alone." The words lingered between them, not accusing, not intrusive, just present, and Alexander felt something shift again, deeper this time, like a door he had kept locked for years had been nudged open without force. He looked out the window, watching the cars pass by in a steady stream, his reflection faintly visible in the glass, and for a moment, he did not recognize the man staring back. "I have been alone for a long time," he admitted quietly, the words leaving him before he could stop them, and when he turned back, Emily was not surprised, not shocked, just listening. "That must be exhausting," she said, her voice carrying a kind of understanding that did not come from pity, but from experience. He frowned slightly, as if considering that idea for the first time, and then, almost reluctantly, he asked, "What About you? Emily let out a small breath, her smile fading just enough to reveal something more real beneath it. I am used to it, she replied, but her eyes told a different story, one filled with late nights, unpaid bills, and quiet struggles no one else noticed. For a moment, they sat there in silence, not uncomfortable, not forced, just shared, and it felt different from any silence Alexander had known before, because this one did not demand anything from him, it simply allowed him to exist. The bell above the diner door chimed suddenly, breaking the moment, and a sharply dressed man stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room with purpose until they landed on Alexander. Emily noticed the change immediately, the way Alexander's posture straightened, the way his expression shifted back into something more controlled, more distant. The man approached quickly, stopping beside the table with a polite but urgent tone. Mr. Hayes, we have been trying to reach you, he said, his voice low but firm. The board meeting was moved up, and everyone is waiting. Emily's eyes flickered between them, confusion crossing her face as the name settled in the air, unfamiliar yet heavy with meaning. But before she could ask anything, Alexander stood, his movements precise, composed, the version of him she had not fully seen yet slipping back into place. He glanced at her for just a second, something unreadable passing through his eyes, something almost like hesitation, before he said, I will be there shortly. And as the man stepped back, Emily remained still, the quiet warmth of the moment fading into something uncertain, as if she had just caught a glimpse of a world far beyond her own. A world that did not quite fit with the man who had once stood in the rain holding a simple sandwich. The name did not leave Emily's mind for the rest of her shift, not because she recognized it, but because of the way it had been said, the way the man in the suit had stood straighter when he spoke it, like it carried weight far beyond a simple introduction. Mr. Hayes. She repeated it quietly to herself as she wiped down tables and refilled coffee cups, her thoughts drifting back to the man who had stood in the rain just days ago, accepting a sandwich like it was something rare, something unfamiliar. It did not match, none of it did, and yet she could not shake the feeling that she had just seen two completely different versions of the same person collide in a single moment. When her shift finally ended and the diner lights dimmed into their softer evening glow, Emily stepped outside, the cool air brushing against her face as the city settled into its usual rhythm, but her mind remained restless. Across town, far from the quiet hum of the diner, Alexander stood at the head of a long glass conference table, the skyline of Chicago stretching endlessly behind him through floor to ceiling windows, the room filled with sharp suits and sharper expectations. Voices moved around him, discussing numbers, projections, decisions worth millions, but for the first time in years, he found it difficult to focus. His fingers rested lightly against the polished surface of the table, his gaze distant, as if part of him had been left somewhere else entirely. Mr. Hayes? Someone prompted, pulling him back, and he straightened almost instantly, the familiar composure snapping back into place, his voice steady, controlled, every word precise as he delivered his response. Yet even as he spoke, a small part of him remained aware of something missing, something quieter than the room he stood in but far more real. Hours later, when the meeting finally ended and the city lights blurred into streaks against the windows of his car, he reached into his coat pocket and paused, his fingers brushing against something soft, a napkin. He pulled it out slowly, unfolding it just enough to see the faint imprint of a coffee cup ring and a simple, uneven line Emily had drawn absent-mindedly while they talked. It was nothing, just paper, disposable, forgettable, and yet he held onto it as if it anchored him to something he did not want to lose. The next afternoon, Emily tried to tell herself she was imagining things, that he would not come back, that people like him did not form habits in places like hers. But when the door chimed again and she looked up, there he was, standing in the same spot as before, his presence quieter now but somehow more certain. This time, she did not hesitate. She walked straight toward him, crossing her arms lightly as she stopped a few feet away, her expression calm but her eyes searching. So, she said, her voice even but edged with curiosity. Mr. Hayes, is it? The name felt unfamiliar on her tongue, but she held his gaze as she said it. Alexander paused, just for a second, the smallest flicker of surprise crossing his face before it disappeared, replaced by something more measured. "That is my name," he replied, his tone neutral, but there was something else beneath it, something cautious. Emily tilted her head slightly, studying him as if trying to piece together a puzzle that did not quite fit. "Funny," she said softly. "You do not look like someone who needs free sandwiches or quiet corners to hide in." The words were not harsh, not accusing, just honest, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then, slowly, Alexander stepped closer, his voice lower this time, stripped of its usual distance. "Maybe I needed it more than you think," he said, and something in the way he said it made Emily pause, because for the first time, it did not sound like a billionaire speaking. It sounded like the same man she had met in the rain, the one who had not known how to ask for anything. And as the space between them settled into a quiet understanding, either of them realized that they were standing at the edge of something fragile, something real, something that could either bring them closer than ever before or pull them apart completely. Emily did not respond right away, not because she did not hear him, but because she was trying to understand the weight behind his words, the quiet honesty that did not match the image forming in her mind of who he might be. She turned slightly, motioning for him to follow as she walked back toward the same booth by the window, the late afternoon light softer now, casting long reflections across the glass. "Sit," she said simply, sliding into her usual spot across from him, her movements calm. But her thoughts anything but. Alexander hesitated for a brief moment before taking the seat, his posture more relaxed than before, though there was still a tension in his shoulders, like he was bracing for something he could not fully predict. Emily folded her hands together on the table, her gaze steady on his. "You keep showing up here," she began, her tone gentle but direct. "And every time, you look like someone who is trying to breathe in a place that does not belong to you, and now I find out you have people chasing you for meetings that sound important." She paused, searching his expression for any sign of resistance, but he remained still, listening. "So help me understand," she continued softly. "Why this place, why me?" The question lingered in the air, simple but impossible to ignore. Alexander looked down briefly, his fingers tracing the edge of the napkin he had kept with him, unfolding it slightly before smoothing it flat against the table. For a moment, it seemed like he might retreat behind the same guarded distance he had shown before, but instead, he exhaled slowly, the sound quiet but heavy. "Because here," he said, his voice lower now, stripped of its usual control, "no one expects anything from me, and you did not look at me like I was something to figure out or something to gain from." Emily blinked, surprised by the vulnerability in his words, and something in her expression softened. "I did not know who you were," she admitted, a faint smile touching her lips. "I just saw someone who looked like they needed help." Alexander nodded once, his gaze lifting to meet hers, and for the first time, there was no distance in it, no calculation, just something real and unguarded. "Exactly," he said quietly, and the single word carried more meaning than any explanation could. The diner hummed softly around them, a few scattered customers, the distant sound of coffee being poured, but at that table, everything felt still, like the world had paused just long enough for something important to settle into place. Emily leaned back slightly, her arms crossing loosely, her eyes thoughtful. "You know," she said after a moment, "people usually come here to escape something, not to find something." And she tilted her head just a little, studying him again. "So what are you escaping?" The question was gentle, not demanding, but it landed deeper than she intended. Alexander's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in hesitation, and for a second, the old version of him almost returned, the one who would deflect, redirect, avoid, but instead, he stayed. "Noise," he said finally, his voice quieter than before. "Expectations, decisions that never stop, people who only see what I have and not who I am." Emily listened without interrupting, her expression steady, and when he finished, she nodded slowly. "That sounds lonely," she said simply, and there was no pity in her voice, just understanding. Alexander let out a small breath, something close to relief, as if hearing the words spoken out loud made it less heavy to carry. Outside, the sky had begun to darken again, the first drops of rain tapping softly against the window, echoing the night they first met, and neither of them noticed how natural it felt to sit there, to talk, to exist without pretense, as if the distance between their worlds had quietly started to shrink, one conversation at a time. The rain outside grew steadier, tracing slow paths down the diner window like quiet reminders of where everything had begun, and for a while, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the silence between them no longer felt empty. It felt understood. Emily glanced at the clock above the counter, realizing her shift was almost over, and for the first time in a long while, she felt something close to hesitation about leaving. "I get off in 10 minutes, she said. Her voice softer now, almost uncertain, as if she was testing the idea before fully committing to it. Alexander looked up, the faintest shift in his expression betraying something he rarely allowed to surface: anticipation. "Do you usually go straight home?" he asked, the question simple, but carrying something more beneath it. Emily shook her head lightly, a small smile forming. "Not really, there is a park a few blocks from here, nothing special, just a place where the city quiets down a little," she said, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of the table. She hesitated for half a second, then added, "Sometimes I go there to think, or not think at all." Alexander held her gaze, and for a moment, the world outside the diner felt distant, irrelevant, like it belonged to someone else entirely. "Can I walk with you?" he asked, his voice lower, more careful than usual, as if the answer mattered more than he wanted to admit. Emily studied him, searching for the guarded distance she had grown used to, but it was not there, at least not in the same way. Instead, she saw something quieter, something real, and she nodded once. "Okay," she said simply. 10 minutes later, the bell above the diner door chimed as they stepped out together, the cool evening air wrapping around them as the rain softened into a light mist. The city lights reflected off the damp pavement, turning the street into a shifting pattern of gold and shadow, and for a while, they walked side by side without speaking, their steps falling into an easy rhythm. It was not uncomfortable, it was not forced, it just was. When they reached the small park, the noise of the city faded just enough to feel distant. The hum of traffic replaced by the quiet rustle of leaves and the soft glow of street lamps lining the path. Emily led him to a worn wooden bench near the center, sitting down as if it was a place she had returned to 100 times before. Alexander followed, lowering himself beside her, his posture more relaxed than it had been all day. "This is your quiet place?" he asked, glancing around at the simple surroundings, the trees, the empty path, the faint sound of water from a nearby fountain. Emily nodded, pulling her jacket tighter around herself. "It is not much," she admitted, "but it does not ask anything from me, and sometimes that is enough." Alexander let out a quiet breath, leaning back slightly, his gaze lifting toward the dim sky above. "I understand that," he said, and for once, it did not sound like something he was trying to convince himself of. Emily turned her head slightly, studying him in the soft light, noticing how different he looked here, how the tension that usually held him together seemed to loosen just a little. "You do not have to go back tonight," she said gently, the words leaving her before she could second-guess them. He looked at her, surprised, not by the suggestion itself, but by the simplicity of it. "Everything you are running from will still be there tomorrow," she continued, her voice calm, certain. "But this moment will not." The words settled between them, quiet but undeniable, and for a long second, Alexander said nothing, his mind pulling in two directions, one toward the life he had always known, the expectations waiting for him, the responsibilities that never paused, and the other toward something unfamiliar, something fragile but real, sitting right beside him on that worn bench. Finally, he exhaled slowly, the sound almost like a release, and leaned back again, his shoulders relaxing in a way they had not in years. "Then I will stay," he said quietly, and as the mist continued to fall and the city moved on without them, either of them realized that this simple choice, this decision to remain in a moment instead of rushing past it, was about to change everything that came next. The park felt different as the night deepened, quieter, more intimate. as if the world had gently stepped back to give space to something fragile unfolding between them. The mist had settled into a soft haze, clinging to the edges of the streetlights and turning everything into a muted glow. And for a long while, neither Emily nor Alexander moved from the bench, both wrapped in a silence that no longer needed to be filled. Emily pulled her knees slightly closer, her fingers tucked into the sleeves of her jacket for warmth, while Alexander sat beside her, his gaze fixed somewhere ahead, but not really seeing the path in front of him. Instead, he was somewhere else entirely, somewhere unfamiliar, a place where he was not calculating outcomes or anticipating demands, a place where he was simply present. "You are thinking again," Emily said softly, not looking at him, but sensing it the way she had learned to sense everything about him. He let out a faint breath, almost a quiet laugh, though it held no humor, only recognition. "I do not know how to stop," he admitted, his voice low, honest in a way that felt almost uncomfortable to him. Emily nodded slowly, as if she had expected that answer. "You do not have to stop," she replied, turning her head slightly toward him, her expression calm. "You just have to let it pass without letting it take everything with it." Her words settled gently, not as advice, but as something lived, something understood, and Alexander felt it in a way he could not quite explain. He turned to look at her then, really look at her, noticing the small details he had overlooked before, the way her hair caught the soft light, the faint tiredness in her eyes that never fully disappeared, the quiet strength in the way she held herself. "How do you do that?" he asked, and there was no pride in the question, no distance, just curiosity. Emily smiled faintly, looking back out at the empty path ahead. "I do not always," she admitted. "Some days I feel like everything is too much, like I am one step away from losing what little I have, but then I remind myself that I have made it through every day before that one, so maybe I can make it through that one too." Alexander listened, the simplicity of her words hitting harder than any speech he had ever heard in a boardroom, because there was no strategy behind them, no expectation, just truth. "You make it sound easy," he said quietly. Emily shook her head, her smile fading into something more real. "It is not easy," she said. "It is just necessary." The air between them shifted again, deeper this time, as if something unspoken had finally been acknowledged. Alexander leaned back slightly, his shoulders relaxing as he let out another slow breath, and for the first time in years, he did not feel the constant pressure pushing against him, did not feel the need to move, to decide, to control. He just sat there, beside someone who did not expect anything from him, and somehow, that felt like everything. After a while, Emily reached into her pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper, smoothing it out on her knee before handing it to him. "Here," she said simply. He took it, glancing down to see a quick, rough sketch of the diner booth by the window, 2 cups of coffee drawn in soft lines, imperfect but unmistakably familiar. "I draw sometimes," she added, her voice quieter now, almost shy. "It helps me think less." Alexander stared at the sketch longer than he expected to, his fingers tracing the faint lines as if they held something more than just ink. It was simple, like everything else about her world, but it felt real in a way his own life rarely did. "You drew this today?" he asked. She nodded once. "During a break," she said. "I guess I wanted to remember it." Alexander looked up at her, something shifting again, something deeper than before, something that felt dangerously close to attachment. "I am glad you did," he said quietly, and the sincerity in his voice surprised even him. Emily met his gaze, and for a moment, the distance between them disappeared completely, replaced by something fragile but undeniable, something that neither of them named, but both of them felt, and as the night stretched on around them, either of them realized that the world they had been avoiding, the one waiting beyond this quiet park, was about to come crashing back in a way that would test everything they had just begun to build. The next morning did not wait for either of them to be ready. It never did. The city woke up loud and fast, pulling people back into the lives they had tried to pause, and for Alexander Hayes, the pause ended the moment he stepped into the sleek glass lobby of his headquarters, the familiar weight settling back onto his shoulders as if it had only been temporarily lifted, Assistants moved quickly around him. Voices low but urgent, screens lighting up with schedules and expectations, and yet, even as he walked through it all, composed and precise, there was something different in the way he carried himself, something quieter beneath the surface. Later that afternoon, the annual Hayes Foundation Gala filled one of the most prestigious hotels in the city, the grand ballroom glowing with chandeliers and polished marble, guests dressed in elegant suits and gowns, their laughter and conversations blending into a carefully curated atmosphere of power and influence. It was a world that felt completely separate from the small diner and the quiet park, a world built on reputation, status, and carefully controlled images. When Alexander stepped onto the stage, the room stilled almost instantly, attention shifting toward him with practiced ease. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Alexander Hayes," the host announced, and the applause that followed was immediate, expected, but for once, it did not feel the same to him. He stood there for a brief moment, looking out at the crowd, the lights bright, the expectations clear, and for the first time, something inside him resisted. Across town, Emily had not planned to be there, not in a place like that, but life had a way of surprising her. One of the diner's regular customers had insisted she take an extra catering shift, promising better pay, and she had said yes without asking too many questions. Now she stood near the back of the ballroom in a simple black uniform, balancing a tray carefully as she moved between guests, her eyes occasionally drifting toward the stage without much interest, until she heard the name, Hayes. Her steps slowed, her breath catching slightly as she turned, her gaze lifting just in time to see him standing under the bright lights, composed, confident, completely at ease in a world she had never imagined him belonging to. For a moment, everything around her blurred, the voices, the movement, the noise fading into the background as the realization settled in. This was who he really was, not the man in the rain, not the quiet presence in the diner, but someone far beyond her reach. Back on stage, Alexander began to speak, his voice steady, practiced, yet as his eyes scanned the room, something unexpected happened. He saw her, standing near the edge of the crowd, frozen, her expression a mix of shock and something deeper, something that felt dangerously close to hurt. The words he had prepared faltered for just a second, a pause so small most people did not notice. But to him, it felt like everything had stopped. Emily set the tray down carefully, her hands steady even as her thoughts raced, and for a moment, she considered leaving. Walking away before anything else could happen, before she had to face what this meant, but something held her there, something unresolved. When Alexander finished his speech, the applause returned, louder than before, but he did not linger. He stepped down quickly, moving through the crowd with purpose, ignoring the people who tried to stop him, until he reached her. For a second, neither of them spoke, the contrast between their worlds standing plainly between them. "You should have told me," Emily said finally, her voice quiet but steady, her eyes searching his. Alexander hesitated, the weight of that truth settling heavily in his chest. "I did not want you to see me the way everyone else does," he replied, his tone softer than it had ever been in this room. Emily shook her head slightly, a faint, bittersweet smile touching her lips. "I already saw you," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "And that version of you, it did not need all of this." The words lingered between them, simple yet undeniable, and for the first time in a long time, Alexander understood something clearly. It was not the world around him that needed to change, it was the way he chose to live in it. He took a small step closer, his voice low, sincere. "Then do not let me go back to being that person," he said, and there was no performance in his words,